Hello, Chipmunk and Chipette fans. My name is Grandy Tamias, the speculative evolved species of upright walking chipmunk, and welcome back to another podcast-style installment of Alvin and The Chipmunks Elaborations. Today's topic being, why is Bagdasarian Productions selling the Alvin and The Chipmunks franchise, and who should buy them? After more than 3 weeks, we still don't have any further updates on the Chipmunk IP being sold besides the initial CNBC article. Many people, myself included, are skeptical if this is even true since we don't have any other sources to corroborate this, such as word from Bagdasarian Productions themselves, and given their history with the franchise, it seems out of character for them to want to do this. Regardless, for the purposes of this video, I'm going to assume that this is true, and I'm still going to be making videos about this stuff up until the end of the year and beyond, unless this all ends up being fake news and the franchise doesn't end up being sold. One thing's for sure, this revelation has gotten the Chipmunk fanbase discussing a lot more actively than it has in quite a while, which has brought up many questions, two of the most prominent being why the Bagdasarian family are trying to sell the IP and who they should sell it to. But first I want to mention two other small things. Number one, their asking price is $300 million, which for reference is about $60 million less than the total box office earnings of the 2007 live-action film. And in the past, they've been described as a multi-billion-dollar franchise. So unless the brand dramatically dropped in value between the end of the movie era and now, Bagdasarian should be asking for a lot more. Granted, $300 million could just be the starting bid, but honestly, I think Alvin and the Chipmunks is worth far more. However, unless competition increases between the different media conglomerates to buy the Chipmunk IP, it could end up being sold at its minimum price. Second, I've seen many memes and discussion thread jokes like, oh, Dave is selling the Chipmunks because they got on his nerves so much. But in reality, the rights to the IP don't just include the 3 Chipmunks. Dave is being sold too, and the Chipettes, and any other characters that Bagdasarian has the rights to, along with the entire back catalog of content that they exclusively own, such as the cartoons, music, and films. Aside from the 20th Century Fox films, but I've already gone over why in several other videos, and possibly the Meat Monster films as well, since they have Universal monsters. So, at the very least, the Chipmunk Adventure and Minimonks. And in this day and age, an extensive back catalog of content is becoming more and more valuable as streaming services are scrambling to expand their libraries, but I'll touch more on that later. Alright, so the first big question is, why? Why would Bagdasarian Productions want to sell the IP that their entire company runs on, especially considering that it's a family relic? Ross Bagdasarian Sr. created it, and his son, Ross Jr., has been caring for it ever since his father passed away in 1972, which is coming up on 50 years now in January. I mean, you think about it, that's a really long time to be upholding your father's legacy, far longer than Ross Sr. himself did, and at an age where Jr. has far surpassed his father. Right now, he's 72, so he and Janice are getting up there in years, and they'll probably end up retiring after the CGI series has concluded, which is still scheduled to be 2025 at the earliest. So the question then becomes, is 50 years really a good point to let go of something sacred to your family and sell it for all it's worth? Would Ross Bagdasarian Sr. even be fine with this? Personally, I don't think Ross Sr. was the kind of person who would have thought his son was morally obligated to carry on what he was doing. In fact, from all the interviews and featurettes I've seen, he wanted Jr. to get a law degree because, well, I'm just going to read from the transcript of the How I Built This interview where Ross Jr. says, quote, well, after my dad passed away and before he passed away, he said, I really want to encourage you to go to law school. And I just hated that idea, but when he passed away, all of a sudden, you saw the kind of folks coming out of the woodwork that would try and take, whether it was music publishing from the family or wineries and vineyards that he had built up over the years, and I realized that my dad wanted me to go to law school, obviously not to become a lawyer, but basically to have a kind of mental martial arts protections, because he always had said, look, there's creating what you do, and then there's continuing to own what you do. End quote. So from all that, you might immediately assume that Ross Sr. expected Jr. to defend the Chipmunks and everything else that he had created because of all those business people who wanted a piece of it after he died. But notice that Ross Jr. says that his father said, encourage. Ross Jr. was never obligated by his father to defend the Chipmunks or carry them on for that matter. But the real takeaway is that he wanted Jr. to know how important it was to be prepared so that whenever some business wanted to use whatever he would end up working so hard for, that he wouldn't be pushed over and taken advantage of. Which is a similar lesson to what Walt Disney believed in, protecting what you create and making sure that your work is valued as your work. Ironic considering that Disney as a corporation now thrives by taking advantage of works created by other people by buying them out. But earlier in that same interview, Ross Bagdasarian Jr. said how, as a kid, he was never interested in the process behind creating the Chipmunk shows and such, and didn't initially want to continue that legacy, not because he didn't love what his father had created, but because they were such big shoes to fill. And I think Ross Sr. knew that, so he probably didn't expect the Chipmunks to last forever or continue on after he died. I'm sure he'd be surprised if he knew that nearly 5 decades later, his son was still keeping the Chipmunks relevant in pop culture and how big of an impact they've had on it. In my initial reaction to this news, I said that Ross Sr. would roll over in his grave at the revelation that the Chipmunks were being sold. Now, after these last couple weeks and going over some of these interview quotes for this video, I'm starting to think that, to Ross Sr., it was never really about the fate of his creations after he was gone, at least not solely, but rather, the real thing he would be most proud of is that his son managed to protect his own hard work for such a long time. In a featurette for Chipwrecked, Ross Jr. said that he wanted to bring the Chipmunks back for just a year or two as a nice gesture to his father and people could appreciate what he had created. But 2 years eventually became multiple generations, and Ross Jr. not only was able to defend his father's creation, but the additions to it that he and his family had created. So that answers half the question, I guess. Ross Bagdasarian Jr. has above and beyond accomplished what his father wanted him to really do for himself, and if that's what matters, then morally it'd be okay to sell off the franchise and retire once reaching a certain age. Whether Ross Bagdasarian Sr. would be fine with what a modern corporation could do with the Chipmunks, I can't say. But we're still missing the other half, the catalyst for the Bagdasarian family wanting to sell the Chipmunks now in the first place. As I said, Ross Bagdasarian Jr. and his wife, Janice Carmen, are in their golden years now, and while they still look pretty good for their age, what with the vegetarian diet and all, it's gonna get harder for them to keep up with the workload that comes with creating a cartoon series, especially one that's independently owned, so they have to do all sorts of things by themselves, like managing the outsourcing of the animation, unlike a series that's directly owned by the network where they can use their own resources, just as an example. Many fans assumed that after the end of the CGI series, one or both of their kids, Vanessa and Michael Bagdasarian, would take ownership of the company and make the next Alvin and the Chipmunks reboot, so that this franchise remains family-owned and operated. After all, they have been extremely protective of the Chipmunks and Chipettes, just like their parents. Well, they're already working on the current series with their parents, as they have since the start of it, and with just the 4 of them and the very few other people they hire, like additional writers, they still are incredibly occupied and don't get a lot of free time. In fact, there's a really good interview with Vanessa Bagdasarian that I'll link in the description where she goes into a lot more detail about what goes into making the series and her own experiences with it, and at one point she mentions how, due to the busy production schedule, she doesn't travel that much and has had to miss out on birthdays and weddings. It's just that hard when you're part of a small independent business and the cost that comes with the exclusivity of a family having creative control of an IP. I'm sure they could all use a break to dedicate more time to their social lives, and maybe they'll want to pursue other things to avoid monotony. Whatever the case, I respect the Bagdasarian family's decision. All I hope is that whatever company owns Alvin and the Chipmunks next, that they assign a very respective creative team to oversee it. And perhaps this might just be wishful thinking on my part, the Bagdasarians could still be involved in some way as consultants. I doubt they'd completely leave the franchise behind. But it will be sad seeing Alvin and the Chipmunks become absorbed into a big company with many other IPs. They're one of the last independently owned media franchises of their kind, and with the way the industry is going, I don't see many more of those popping up. As for potential buyers, I'm going to try keeping this section as short as possible. The CNBC article did mention Viacom, the company that owns Paramount and Nickelodeon, and they're probably the most likely candidate at this point. For the same reason as Universal back when that company co-owned the Chipmunks in the 90s. Disney has Mickey Mouse, Warner Brothers has Bugs Bunny, Universal and Paramount don't really have their own mascots in that manner, and since I doubt they'll sell to Universal again, Paramount would benefit from the popularity of the Chipmunks. The studio hasn't been performing as well at the box office in recent years, so if they're desperate enough, they may end up buying the Chipmunks as their last hope. But they've been pretty notorious for copyright against fan work, so I'd be really concerned about my ability to make content for this channel if they buy them. Warner Media and Netflix were also mentioned in the article, but these are just rumored based on the fact that they, like Paramount, have been looking to add more content to their streaming services. Netflix is the most synonymous with streaming, and as much as I wouldn't mind a Netflix-exclusive Chipmunk cartoon or the older shows being made available there, it limits the possibility of seeing the Chipmunks in new theatrical films. Warner Media, I'd be perfectly fine with. In my streaming elaboration, HBO Max was one of my higher choices for where I would want to see Chipmunk content, and I think they could make a good Chipmunk film either being a live-action reboot or with their Warner Animation Group. Disney, Sony, and Hasbro have been rumored as well. Sony, I don't really have anything to say. Disney, just hell no. They got too big when they bought Lucasfilm, and Fox only proved that point several times over. Besides, they already own Chip and Dale. We don't need them having a monopoly on talking chipmunks. Hasbro is an interesting one. They don't outright distribute films. They've needed studios like Paramount for that, but they have other media subsidiaries for television and film production, with a number of children's IPs under their belt, like My Little Pony and Power Rangers, so the Chipmunks would fit right in. Plus, they make toys, so maybe we could finally get more Chipmunk merch since Mattel gave up on the CGI series line. Anyway, that's all the time I have. Feel free to let me know in the comments, do you respect the Bagdasarians' decision? Do you still think it's a bad idea? And what company do you think should own Alvin and the Chipmunks? Along with any suggestions you have for future video topics. Don't forget that you're also welcome to leave a like, subscribe. I'd appreciate it if you could share this video, follow me on Twitter, join my Discord. With all that said, I hope you enjoyed, have a nice day, and thank you for your time.